The desert night wrapped itself around Las Vegas like a mink stole, soft, expensive, a little dishonest. Inside the sands, the air was different. Cigarette smoke floated in the spotlight beams like ghostly confetti. Martini glasses clinked against ice. And somewhere behind the curtain, the band counted off the next number. The year was 1976, and the world still believed in magic. And then he walked out. Dean Martin didn't enter a room so much as he changed its temperature. The applause hit him like a wave, but he rode it effortlessly, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a cigarette as if the world moved at his pace and is alone. The tuxedo fit like it had been sewn onto his skin, the bow tie just crooked enough to feel dangerous. He let the laughter wash over him after the first joke, then gave the room that lazy sideways smile that made men want to buy him a drink and women want to tell him their secrets. "Good evening," he drawled, slurring just enough to make it seem like he'd already had too much. "I'd like to do some serious singing for you tonight, but I left my voice in the bar." The crowd roared. The orchestra punched in behind him, and suddenly there was only the music, the lights, and the illusion that this man lived his entire life slightly tipsy and entirely unbothered. What they couldn't see was the careful precision behind every gesture, the stone-cold sobriety behind the drunk act, the profound loneliness behind the effortless charm. But somewhere in America, Jerry Lewis was watching on television, and the sight of his former partner gliding across that stage like nothing in the world had ever hurt him was almost too much to bear. The same man who had once shared 10 years of grime, cheap dressing rooms, and the kind of laughter that leaves you gasping for air. Now they were strangers, separated by more than just distance, by pride, by wounds, by 20 years of silence. The band kept playing, but something in Jerry had already left the building, because what the audience didn't know, what most of the world would never understand, is that Dean Martin's greatest performance wasn't the drunk act, or the songs, or the movies. It was the way he could exist 10,000 miles from the man who knew him best and pretend it didn't ache every single day. 1 year later, on June 7th, 1977, that ache would pick up a telephone. It was Dean's 60th birthday. No orchestra now, no spotlight, just the heavy stillness of a Beverly Hills mansion where the curtains stayed half drawn, and the world had shrunk to a few familiar rooms. On the other end of a phone line, Jerry Lewis stared at the numbers, his finger hovering, that old stage fright, the kind you can't joke your way out of, curling in his chest. For 21 years, he had carried the laugh loud and the hurt quiet. For 21 years, neither of them had found the right words, or maybe the right courage, to bridge the distance. But this was Dean's birthday, and time wasn't playing fair anymore. He dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, a voice picked up, polite, controlled. The voice of a man whose entire job was to stand between a legend and the rest of the world. Mr. Martin's residence. Jerry swallowed. "It's Jerry. Jerry Lewis. I'd like to speak to Dean." There was a pause on the line. Not long, just long enough to feel like a verdict. Then the butler's voice returned, carrying a message that Dean Martin himself had prepared for exactly this possibility. The words were simple, devastating, final, and they would break the heart of the man who had spent his life making the world laugh. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, but stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to July 1946, when 2 young performers met in a nightclub and changed entertainment history forever. The air inside the 500 Club hung thick with cigarette smoke and broken dreams, the kind of Atlantic City dive where the tablecloths were clean, but the hopes weren't. July 1946, and the boardwalk outside pulsed with post-war energy, but inside this cramped nightclub, time moved differently. Slower, heavier, like molasses mixed with desperation. Dean Martin stood at the small backstage area, 29 years old, and already carrying the weight of too many almosts. Almost famous, almost solvent, almost happy. His first marriage had crumbled like stale bread, leaving him with alimony payments and a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. The tuxedo he wore had been pressed so many times the fabric was starting to shine in the wrong places, but when he walked onto that tiny stage, he made it look like it cost a fortune. That was his magic, making everything appear effortless when nothing in his life had ever been easy. He was halfway through his second number, voice like velvet and smoke, when the storm hit. Jerry Lewis was 20 years old and made entirely of electricity and need. Skinny, sharp-elbowed, vibrating with the kind of manic energy that made people either laugh or call security. He'd been pacing the wings like a caged animal, watching Dean command the room with that lazy, tilted smile, and something in Jerry's restless brain decided that interrupting this smooth crooner would be the most brilliant thing in the world. He exploded onto the stage like a cartoon character come to life, all flailing limbs and rubber faces, crashing through Dean's carefully orchestrated performance with the subtlety of a freight train. Any other singer would have frozen, would have bristled, would have had the kid thrown out, but Dean Martin wasn't any other singer. For a split second, time suspended itself. This was the glitch, the moment where everything could have gone wrong. Instead, Dean looked at this wild child disrupting his act and made a choice that would change entertainment history. He didn't fight the chaos. He welcomed it. He leaned against the piano, lit a cigarette with practiced calm, and became the cool eye of Jerry's hurricane. When Jerry poured water over a heckler, Dean just raised an eyebrow and delivered a line with that slow, effortless drawl that made women swoon and men roar. The audience, who had been politely appreciating Dean's singing, suddenly exploded with laughter. Real laughter, the kind that hurts your stomach and makes you forget about wars and bills and all the small disappointments that fill ordinary lives. They weren't just two performers anymore. They were a single organism, Jerry the rocket, and Dean the steady ground beneath his feet. The applause that followed wasn't polite nightclub appreciation. It was thunder. People pounding tables so hard drinks toppled, couples wiping tears from their eyes. After the show, in that cramped dressing room that smelled of old cologne and fresh possibilities, they shook hands on a partnership. No lawyers, no contracts, just two men who recognized something in each other. Dean saw a kid who could launch them both into the stratosphere. Jerry saw the father figure he'd been searching for his entire life. Within months, they would go from $500 a week to the biggest act in America. But even in that moment of triumph, neither man could see the trap they were building. They had created a dynamic where Jerry needed Dean to be his anchor, and Dean needed Jerry to be his lightning rod. It was perfect chemistry, but it was also a time bomb. Success would make them immortal, but immortality was already beginning to ask its price. By the mid-1950s, the cameras didn't just capture Martin and Lewis, they devoured them. Every magazine cover, every television appearance, every movie premiere became a feeding frenzy. And somehow, Jerry Lewis always ended up in the center of the frame, while Dean Martin drifted toward the edges like expensive cologne. They were the biggest act in show business, selling out the Paramount Theater 17 times over, their names lighting up marquees from coast to coast. But the spotlight had developed a cruel sense of direction. The public saw exactly what they wanted to see. Dean Martin, the lucky drunk who stumbled through scenes with a perpetual cocktail and couldn't be bothered to care about anything more demanding than his next drink. Jerry Lewis, the manic genius burning himself alive to make the world laugh. It was a perfect narrative, clean and simple, and it was slowly killing one of them. What the audience didn't see was Dean arriving at the studio 2 hours early, scripts annotated in his careful handwriting, every line memorized, every cue marked. They didn't see him knowing the names of every crew member, from the key grip to the craft services lady. The drunk act was precision masquerading as carelessness, a man so professional he could make sobriety look like intoxication. But straight men don't get their names above the title. They don't get the magazine covers. They become handsome furniture for the real star to lean against. Jerry's hunger had evolved into something more dangerous than ambition. It wasn't enough to be successful. He needed to be acknowledged as the auteur, the visionary, the one who made the magic happen. Magazine interviews became solo performances where Dean's contributions shrank in the retelling. Jerry Lewis reveals the secret behind their success. The headlines would read, and somehow that secret never included the man who held the whole thing together like a kite string, keeping the comedy from crashing into the trees. While the world praised the kite for flying so high, the scripts began to change. Dean's lines were trimmed, his character flattened, his songs cut shorter to make room for Jerry's expanding vision. In creative meetings, Jerry would whisper to directors, rearrange gags, fine-tune routines without always including his partner in the conversation. The balance was shifting, not just in public perception but in the actual power behind their success. Dean absorbed it all with that carefully maintained cool. His philosophy was simple. You don't explain yourself. You don't make excuses. You just do the work and let it speak. But dignity has its limits, and watching your own erasure in real time tests even the strongest man's resolve. He began to retreat, not in anger, but in self-preservation, building a fortress out of indifference. If the world wanted to believe he was nothing but a pretty face who got lucky, he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him sweat. The breaking point came not with shouting or thrown punches, but with something far more devastating. During a late-night rehearsal, when Jerry pushed too hard about a script change that would further diminish Dean's role, Dean looked at his partner with those steady, unreadable eyes and said 6 words that would echo for decades. You can have it, all of it. No drama, no scene. Just the quiet recognition that some partnerships become prisons, and sometimes the only way to save yourself is to walk away from everything you've built together. The silence began that night, and it would grow like a shadow, following them both into separate futures neither of them had planned. The critics wrote Dean Martin's obituary the moment he walked away from Jerry Lewis, predicting he'd fade into obscurity within a year. They were spectacularly wrong. What they didn't understand was that Dean had been playing a character all along, and now he was free to construct his masterpiece. A persona so perfectly calibrated it would make him bigger alone than he'd ever been with anyone else, while simultaneously building the most beautiful prison in Hollywood. The reinvention began with a refusal. No more partnerships, no more sharing spotlights. Just a man, a microphone, and the deliberate construction of armor disguised as indifference. By 1960, Dean Martin had become the king of cool, but the crown was heavier than anyone imagined. On stage at the Sands with Frank and Sammy, he held a rocks glass filled with apple juice that every audience member swore was scotch. He slurred punchlines with the precision of a sniper, stumbled over microphone cords with the grace of a ballet dancer. The world laughed at the lovable lush, never realizing they were watching one of the most disciplined performers in entertainment history. While Frank Sinatra partied until dawn, dragging entourages into chaos, Dean would slip away unnoticed, return to his room, eat a sandwich, watch a Western, and be on the golf course by 8 the next morning, clear-eyed and sharp. The drunkenness was perfect social camouflage. If people thought you were tipsy, they didn't expect deep conversation, didn't ask for your soul, didn't demand intimacy. They just laughed and let you be. Between takes of his NBC variety show, he sat stone-cold sober with a paperback novel, reading about cowboys and frontier justice, while makeup artists buzzed around him like bees around honey. His acts of kindness happened in the margins, in spaces where cameras couldn't reach. When a young dancer was reduced to tears by a snarling choreographer, Dean didn't explode or call meetings. He simply rested a gentle hand on her shoulder, suggested she take a moment, and the next day that choreographer wasn't yelling anymore. No announcements, no explanations. When a stagehand's wife got cancer, the medical bills quietly disappeared. When Frank flew into one of his legendary rages at some terrified waiter, Dean would silently slip the staff member $100 bill and a wink that said everything would be fine. He gave his money freely but hoarded his emotions like gold. The only person who held the combination to Dean's emotional safe was his son, Dean Paul. They were kindred spirits in a world of yes-men and sycophants. In private moments, sitting together in the screening room watching old movies without speaking, the king of cool became just Dad, and that transformation was more profound than any stage performance. Meanwhile, Jerry Lewis was building his own empire, directing, writing, starring, conquering Hollywood on his own terms. But the silence between them had hardened into something unbreachable. Interviewers learned the unspoken rule quickly. You don't ask Dean about Jerry, and you don't ask Jerry about Dean. They existed like two planets that had spun out of the same solar system, drifting into colder, darker space. Success had saved Dean from disappearing into Jerry's shadow, but it had also cost him something irreplaceable, the ability to be truly known. He had perfected the art of being present while absent, of looking someone in the eye while his mind was 1,000 miles away. The coolest man alive had become completely unreachable, and that isolation would only deepen as the years passed, setting the stage for a phone call that would test whether some silences are too profound to break. Frank Sinatra believed he could orchestrate miracles with the same precision he brought to a recording session, and in September 1976, he decided to conduct the most dangerous performance of his career, reuniting two broken hearts on live television without either man's permission. The MDA Telethon was Jerry's annual kingdom, 21 hours of controlled chaos, where he transformed his own exhaustion into currency for sick children. Frank saw it as the perfect stage for his grand manipulation, a moment so public and so emotionally charged that neither Dean nor Jerry could resist playing their parts. Dean Martin sat in his dressing room at the Sahara, adjusting his bow tie with the mechanical precision of a man preparing for surgery. Frank had cornered him weeks earlier with that particular blend of charm and veiled threat that made saying no feel like betrayal. Dean hadn't wanted this. He understood, with the clarity that comes from 20 years of careful distance, that some doors close for good reason. But Frank was family, and in their world, family meant showing up, even when showing up might destroy you. So, Dean agreed, driven partly by loyalty and partly by a dangerous curiosity about what it would feel like to stand next to his other half after 2 decades of silence. Meanwhile, at the telethon, Jerry Lewis was already deep in that strange, half-dream state that came from pushing his body past its limits. The studio lights were merciless, the phones never stopped ringing, and somewhere between comedy bits and desperate pleas for donations, Jerry was living entirely on adrenaline and muscle memory. He controlled every camera angle, every lighting cue, every second of the broadcast with the obsessive precision of a man who had built his kingdom on the foundation of never letting anyone down. He had no idea that Frank Sinatra was about to detonate 20 years of carefully maintained peace. When Frank walked onto the stage, the audience erupted with genuine joy. Jerry's face lit up. Sinatra was ratings gold, and genuine friendship rolled into one perfect package. They joked, they sang, they moved the needle on the tote board. And then, mid-conversation, Frank tilted his head toward the wings with the casual confidence of a man who had never met a moment he couldn't control. "I have a friend of yours here." Dean Martin stepped into the light, and the world forgot how to breathe. The reaction wasn't just applause. It was seismic. People stood up in their living rooms across America. Jerry's face crumpled like tissue paper. 20 years of carefully buried emotion flooding to the surface in a single devastating instant. Dean walked toward him with that familiar, easy stride, hands in his pockets, looking like he was strolling to the corner store rather than walking into the most emotionally charged moment in television history. Jerry folded into him, clutching him like a drowning man. The tears came in waves, gratitude, disbelief, apologies that had been rehearsed in private for decades. Dean held him with gentle, brotherly affection, patting his back while his own eyes remained carefully dry. He was present, He was kind, but he was also professionally distant, giving Jerry exactly what the moment required while protecting what he couldn't afford to lose. "So, you working?" Dean quipped, breaking the tension with perfect timing, and America roared with relief. For a few magical minutes, the greatest comedy partnership in history shared a microphone again. The cameras captured what looked like healing, but Dean felt the weight of history pressing down like a lead blanket. He saw the desperate hope in Jerry's eyes, the years etched into his face, and knew instantly that this wasn't a beginning. It was the most beautiful goodbye he'd ever have to give. Backstage, when the lights cooled and the cables lay coiled like sleeping snakes, there were no grand confessions, no plans for the future, just polite pleasantries, the careful dance of two strangers who knew each other better than anyone else on earth. Dean didn't linger. He had given Jerry his moment, given America its miracle, and now he retreated behind his carefully constructed walls. The world decided the feud was over, but Dean Martin knew better. The reunion had ripped the scab off a wound that had taken 20 years to heal, reminding him exactly why the silence had been necessary in the first place. 8 months later, when the phone rang on his birthday, he would make sure the message was unmistakable. June 7th, 1977, arrived in Beverly Hills like an unwelcome guest, slipping through the morning shadows of Dean Martin's mansion with the quiet persistence of time itself. The house felt larger than it should have, rooms echoing with the particular silence that money can buy, but cannot fill. Dean sat in his favorite chair, 60 years old as of that morning, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he stared at a television that wasn't turned on. The industry had already begun its ritual of birthday acknowledgments, flowers, telegrams, calls routed through his staff, all the hollow gestures that fame requires and friendship rarely survives. But Dean wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about the phone call he knew was coming, the one he'd been preparing for since that night at the telethon when he'd held Jerry Lewis for 30 seconds and felt the weight of 20 years collapse into a single, dangerous moment of hope. He'd given Jerry that embrace, given America its miracle, and now he would have to deliver the hardest performance of his life, saying no to the man who had once been his other half. 3,000 miles away, Jerry Lewis stared at his telephone like it was a loaded gun pointed at his own heart. He'd been rehearsing this moment for months, constructing and deconstructing the perfect words that might bridge 2 decades of silence. The telethon reunion had awakened something in him, a desperate, intoxicating belief that maybe the door wasn't completely closed. Dean had smiled, hadn't he? Had joked, had held him, had given the world that beautiful moment of reconciliation. Surely 60 years on this earth was enough time for old wounds to become old stories, for pride to soften into something more forgiving. Jerry's finger traced the numbers he'd memorized, but never dialed. Each rotation of the rotary phone felt like a small act of courage, each click a step closer to either redemption or devastation. He told himself it was just a birthday call, just a simple gesture between old friends, but his hand shook with the knowledge that this moment would define the rest of both their lives. The phone rang in that big, quiet house. Once, twice, 3 times. Dean heard it from the den where he sat with perfect stillness, stone-cold sober at noon on his birthday. He didn't move. The butler, a man trained to be the gatekeeper between a legend and the rest of the world, moved through the hallway with practiced efficiency, carrying the weight of instructions delivered weeks earlier in Dean's calm, matter-of-fact tone that left no room for negotiation. Mr. Martin's residence. Jerry's voice came through the line, smaller than it should have been, stripped of all the manic energy that had made him famous. "It's Jerry Lewis. I'd like to speak to Dean." The pause that followed wasn't the clumsy kind, but a measured, professional silence. The butler glanced toward the den where Dean sat, still as a statue, then returned to the phone with the precision of a man who understood that some messages are too important to deliver carelessly. "Mr. Martin asked me to tell you that he wishes you well," the butler said. his voice professionally neutral, but carrying words that Dean had chosen with surgical precision. "But he has nothing more to say to you. He hopes you'll understand and respect his wishes." The line went quiet. Not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of a heart breaking in real time. Jerry held the receiver against his ear long after the butler had gently disconnected, listening to the dial tone like it might contain some hidden message, some secret code that would make this mean something other than what it clearly meant. Dean had given him an answer, not in anger, not in cruelty, but with the same careful dignity he'd maintained for 20 years. This wasn't a door slammed in rage. It was a door quietly, firmly closed by a man who understood that some relationships exist most perfectly in memory, and any attempt to resurrect them would only create a grotesque parody of what they'd once been. The butler had delivered more than a rejection that day. He had carried Dean Martin's final lesson about love and limits, about the courage to disappoint someone rather than disappoint the sacred memory of what you'd shared together. In refusing to engage, Dean was protecting both of them from discovering that the magic they'd created couldn't be recreated, that the men they'd become couldn't fit back into the shapes they'd been when the world was young and anything seemed possible. The years that followed drifted by like smoke from one of Dean's cigarettes, quiet, hazy, and increasingly solitary. The silence he had chosen on that birthday became his most faithful companion, wrapping around him like an expensive overcoat he could never quite remove. While Jerry Lewis continued to fight time with telethons and interviews and a desperate, beautiful need to be understood, Dean Martin simply began to fade. Not all at once, but by degrees, shedding the public persona layer by layer, until only the man remained, sitting in his Beverly Hills mansion, watching old westerns with the volume turned low, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts that now outnumbered the living. He continued to work, because that's what professionals do, but the joy had been replaced by quiet endurance. The King of Cool performed his final shows with the same effortless precision, but friends noticed something different in his eyes, a distance that went deeper than his usual protective detachment. He was already saying goodbye, though no one understood it at the time. Then came 1987, and the blow that shattered even Dean's impenetrable armor. His son Dean Paul, Dino to those who loved him, died in a plane crash while serving in the Air National Guard. The news didn't just wound Dean, it hollowed him completely. The man who had survived poverty, fame, divorce, and the most public breakup in entertainment history could not survive the loss of the one person who truly knew him. He withdrew completely after that, the performance finally ending after 40 years of making the difficult look easy. Meanwhile, Jerry Lewis underwent his own transformation. The hurt from that birthday phone call didn't disappear. Wounds that deep never fully heal, but it evolved into something closer to wisdom. In interviews during the 80s and 90s, when younger journalists would inevitably ask about Dean, Jerry's answers began to change. The defensiveness melted away, replaced by reverence. He started talking about Dean's genius, his hidden strength, his quiet professionalism that had made all of Jerry's beautiful chaos possible. He became the keeper of their shared flame, ensuring the world remembered Dean not just as the straight man, but as the essential half of the miracle. What emerged was a remarkable truth that spoke to Dean's character. He had never spoken ill of Jerry Lewis, not once, not in private conversations with Frank Sinatra over late-night drinks, not in unguarded moments with his children, not even in the darkest hours after his son's death, when bitterness would have been entirely justified. He maintained his dignity like a sacred vow, understanding that speaking badly about Jerry would diminish what they'd created together. Their children maintained friendships across the divide their fathers had created, gathering at holidays and celebrations, carrying forward a relationship their fathers couldn't. It was a quiet rebellion and a profound tribute, proof that love doesn't always follow the paths we expect. When Dean Martin died on Christmas morning 1995, Jerry Lewis stood at the funeral with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding the conversation they'd been having all along. The silence hadn't been punishment. It had been preservation. Dean had loved him enough to let him go, loved their shared history enough to protect it from the inevitable disappointments that come when you try to resurrect what can only exist perfectly in memory. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis created magic together and created different magic apart. The telephone call that never happened was its own kind of conversation, its own kind of closure. In the end, Dean's silence spoke louder than any words ever could have. He taught Jerry, and teaches us, that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the truth, even when the truth is silence, especially when the truth is silence.